I guess the place to begin, I'm going to do this a little more informally since we don't have a lectern and all of that, but I think the place where I begin with all this is in thinking about some of the watchwords, so to speak, of the 21st century, such as globalization and interconnectedness and the global in general, global citizenship. Every college and university in the United States, down to the most humble and unprepossessing, all the way up to Stanford, espouses a notion of global citizenship as a self-evident good. Behind all of this, I think, is a narrative of modernity, a narrative that sees the world, sees the history of the world, the movement of the world, in a certain way, as inexorably moving towards the breaking down of provincialities, of particularities, of particular associations, whether ethnic or national or linguistic or cultural or whatever, and moving towards a greater and greater degree of integration. Integration of economies, notably, of economic activity, integration of culture, integration eventually even of governance. There are capitalist and socialist versions of this, and others sort of in between. The socialist one everyone is familiar with, but certainly the liberal or neoliberal one that's founded on a global capitalist ideal would also be one. A world characterized by free markets, free, unimpeded movement of capital and labor across national boundaries. And maybe this tends more to the socialist side than the capitalist side, but an emphasis on multilateral, multinational institutions, which lay the groundwork for some kind of global regime. All of these are seen as parts, different byways perhaps, but parts of this general, what I'm calling a narrative of modernity. Certainly the rise, somewhat in doubt at the moment, but of the European Union would be an example of this narrative. And in particular, in emphasizing the ways in which the nation state, for so long seen as the essential building block of the world order, is coming to be de-emphasized. It's even seen as an entity whose whose days are numbered. Also, another element of this narrative is an emphasis on mobility, on individual liberty of movement, the emphasis on, and now we get to our title, on place, on the ways in which an individual person needs to be rooted in a particular setting, a particular locale, particular milieu, for the possibility of a flourishing human life. That has to, in the past, the assumption has always been that has to take place within a particular cultural, linguistic context. That, too, is an assumption that the narrative of modernity, or post-modernity, if you like, is challenging. And I think it's interesting you can put together the loss of scale, that is, of a sense of human, local, approximate scale in institutions, accompanies a loss of the sense of place. The two things seem to go together, up and down the scale of organization. But I think this is a good moment for us to think critically about, even to challenge this narrative of that it says bigger is better integrated is better, consolidated is better, centralized is better. And I think, if for no other reason, the near collapse of the world's financial system just a mere months ago, in ways that affected all of us deeply, is a good example. That is an example of the ways in which size, not just the size of particular institutions in this country or other countries, but the size of the interconnected system, world financial system, led to a kind of systemic risk that I think is best compared, and I speak as a non-economist here, so I partly think it's best compared because I understand the comparison, but I think it's well compared to some of the incidents that have taken place over the last 10 or 15 years in which an entire power grid for some large region of the country or the continent will be knocked out by one event. There was an incident in 1996 in Oregon where a tree fell on a transformer in one remote place, ended up knocking out the entire West Coast for a period of, or much of the West Coast for a period of days. There was a similar incident in the Northeast in 2003. These are examples of systemic risk that a highly interconnected system is also highly vulnerable. Let me read you an economic analyst's comments on how this relates to financial systems. It may be true, in fact, that complex networks such as financial systems face an inescapable trade-off. And we're going to come back to that word, that concept of trade-off throughout here. Trade-off between size and efficiency on the one hand and global stability on the other. Once they have been assembled, in other words, globally interconnected and integrated financial networks may just be too complex to prevent crises like the current one from recurring. Rather than waiting until the next cascade is imminent and then following the usual modus operandi of propping up the handful of firms that seem to pose the greatest threat, it may be time for a new approach, preventing the system from becoming overly complex in the first place. So there you have, in a way, someone who's challenging the narrative with regard to the world financial system. Yeah, and you consider we're all very excited, or some of us are. I'm not actually terribly excited myself, but about the growth of social networking and the ways in which instantaneous communication and interconnectedness is so easily achieved now. And yet, this may well be an example of the same phenomenon. Once everything is interconnected, problems spread just as fast as solutions. This cascading effect that we saw in the financial systems can replicate itself in all sorts of other ways. And so that often we end up using the language of epidemiology to describe the way things spread through these networks. I mean, consider viral videos. Finally, on the financial business, and I won't say a lot about that, but that it may be that those entities that are too big to fail are probably better understood as being too big to exist, at least in the view of this economist whom I quoted just a moment ago. So again, I think the purpose of my talk is not to address the financial crisis and what should be done about it, and whether we should have tougher antitrust laws or whatever. I mean, it'd be fun to talk about that. I'm more than open to it, but that's not really my purpose. It's the push back against the narrative, in particular with regard to this issue of place, and I'll have more to say about that in a moment. And I would say, too, that I'm not entering into this with the notion that all large-scale consolidation of economy, of culture, of governance is wrong. There may be It may be so in some cases, maybe not in others. What I want to encourage us to do is be more discerning in the way we think about it, not to be captives of the narrative, of the notion of the inexorable movement of history. And in particular, to consider that questions of place and scale, that really the two kind of go together, as I've said, are elements in human flourishing, that they ought to come into play when we think about the efficacy of these systems. So I'm not necessarily, and those of you who are participating in the seminar may wonder about this from the readings, but I'm not necessarily engaging in a brief for localism or for the preservation of indigenous cultures or for semi-autonomous regional entities or even for the perpetuation of the nation state. I'm not necessarily advocating any of those things in particular. Nor am I advocating decentralization for some ideological reason. Instead, what I want to encourage us to do is to think in every instance about what seems best, what works best, what's most adaptable to the particular circumstances at hand, of thinking always about the virtues and limitations of the human person as he or she exists, not as he or she can be imagined to be. My own particular interest is in pushing back with regard to the ways in which the question of place and scale involve us in intrinsic characteristics and defining limitations that are intrinsic to what we are as human beings. A machine that is relentlessly, remorselessly efficient, but at the expense of offering the possibility of human empowerment, the use of one's hands, is not necessarily a good thing. An economic system that achieves incredible efficiencies of scale at the expense of human well-being is not necessarily a good system. A political system that obliterates rooted local cultures and disempowers citizens in the name of great national efficiencies and global integration is not necessarily a good political system from the standpoint of human flourishing. But at the same time, I think we need to be alert to ways that particularism and local scale work against human flourishing. And the opening of the world that's occurred in our lifetimes, has occurred in the last 4 or 5 decades particularly, has been in some respects a great enhancement of life. In some respects, we don't want to look at these matters in a sentimental or nostalgic way and take for granted the gains and benefits. At least we want to think in terms of trade-offs. So we want to think about the ways that the benefits of integration and the benefits of localism can be weighed against one another and perhaps balanced. The Greek philosopher Aristotle thought that there was an optimal size and population for a flourishing and well-regulated city. Not too small, but also not too large. Also, Aristotle thought something really quite astonishing, I think, to our ears, that the city was prior to the individual. That is to say, the city represented a kind of wholeness of which individuals were a part. After all, Aristotle says in the Politics that the individual who lives outside of the city is either a beast or a god, that the human beings are by nature political animals. And to be a political animal doesn't mean that you're like Karl Rove or James Carville. It means that you live in political entities. I mean, we might use the term social being. It's not quite the same thing as what Aristotle means, but it at least avoids the Karl Rove, James Carville image, which is certainly not what Aristotle meant. So the city for him is is so essential to the fulfillment of human nature, to the flourishing of human life, that he goes so far as to say that it is prior, logically prior, to the individual. It is that the individual draws the fullest measure of his or her being from the existence of the city. That's, I think, if there's any truth to that at all, that's a very powerful message for us with regard to the importance of place. And I'm going to come back to that several times. He also argues that different human activities seem to flourish best in differently sized and shaped groups. Human associations are not like bathrobes. One size does not fit all. So these different sizes and scales and shapes range from the character of the family, character-forming unit of the family, the moral community of a church or other religious organization, all the way up the scale to the pervasive fluidities of and vast economies of scale in a modern industrial or global business enterprise. This diversity that Aristotle sees, that certain human tasks are better assigned to units of a different size and shape than others. That the city is not good for the rearing of children. It's one of the criticisms he has of Plato. But that the family is not good for organizing an economy. And the village is not a good way to organize an economy. Because the village, he saw the village as simply a collection of families. The city was something else. And the city was the largest size of association of families and villages that could produce an economy that was reasonably self-sufficient. And anything that got bigger than that for him became problematic because of its size. It began to lose the character-forming qualities, including opportunities for the exercise of virtue that ought to be the character, the mark of the best form of collective life. And Aristotle also says, I'll stop quoting Aristotle, I promise, but once you get started, it's hard to stop. That the purpose of the city is not just the living of life, but the living of the good life. And by the good life, he means the optimal life, the fullest expression of human nature, of human possibility. So this diversity that he sees as a feature of the city and of different human associations is I think, the same recognition that's behind the idea of what's called subsidiarity. That is a notion, that really a tradition coming out of Roman Catholic social thought, that the organization that is best suited for some particular social task is the one that is closest, smallest and closest to the phenomenon being addressed, so that social welfare programs are better administered locally than by centralized bureaucracies, as one of many examples of subsidiarity. We have a kind of subsidiarity principle in American history in the constitutional scheme of American government, and that's the idea of federalism with the small f. I mean, everybody thinks, when they think the word federal, they think of Washington, controlling everything. But in fact, the federal idea is the opposite, or close to being the opposite of that. And that the federal idea being a division between those things that are the responsibility of the national government, those things that are responsibility of states and localities, and all the way down to the lowest level, smallest level of organization. So federalism is also a very important part of the American system. And even now, when we have so much that's centralized, you ask most Europeans or people people from who've experienced other forms of government, they're baffled by American federalism. It just it's like, what? This is the county, this is the state. You know, it's so alien to their experience, particularly the French, I find, because they're used to such a centralized administrative state which has been in place for a long time. The American way seems very confusing to them. So we still have it. We still have this notion that there are various ways in which the competing modalities of scale and changing significances of geographical place affect flourishing in all of these different contexts. So, so part of what I'm concerned with then is the question of trade-offs between the different modalities of scale, but especially want to now talk mainly about the issue of place. It was really, when you think about it, not that many years ago, maybe 100 years ago or so, that the lives of most Americans were confined within a fairly narrow local radius. The historian Robert Weavy described, actually a little more than 100 years ago, maybe 150 years ago, that America as a nation of island communities. A beautiful expression when you think about it, because prevents you think of the vast array of small towns spreading across westward, across the Midwest, across the Great Plains, all the way to the West Coast, as these only very tenuously linked settlements that for the most part, were concerned with themselves, with their own life. And there's, just let me give one example that I think makes vivid what a different world it was. And again, not that many years ago, that in the years after the Civil War, when the railroad system was really completing itself around the country, there still was no standardization of time in the country. That noon was whenever the sun was in the zenith in the place where you happened to be standing. And think about that for a second, of what it'd be like to live in a country in which the noon that you experience here, and the noon in Sacramento, and the noon in Carson City, and the noon in Laramie, Wyoming, and everything is different. And actually, it's a sort of steady spectrum of temporal change, in moving with the different location of the sun. In other words, time was entirely local. And time, one of the fundamental elements, one of the fundamental grids of human experience. It was, by the way, not the government, but the railroads that brought about the standardization of time zones in this country. It happened differently in Europe, but because the railroads had to have timetables, you have to have standardization of time. So it came about for pragmatic reasons. But think back, if you can imagine a world before that. That's Robert Weavy's world of America's island communities. The ability of these communities to communicate with one another across large spaces and large distances was limited by these vast, impenetrable seas of space and time that separated them, and the immense amount of time it took to physically traverse the distance. So, to go to my title, one's place in the world, your place in the world was, for the most part, for most men and women, not a problematic thing at all, or a puzzle or an enigma, as so many of us find it now to be. With very rare exceptions, the person that one became and the life that one lived was linked to the geographical location where one was born and raised. These factors were understood as the structural mold of one's worldly existence, and nearly nearly as hard and fast as one's biological makeup. But we all know what happened. A cascading array of technological and social innovations has, with astonishing speed, rendered these barriers obsolete, and not only in the continental United States, but in the entire world. Rapid communications, instantaneous communications, inexpensive travel have eliminated the isolation of provincial life and resulted in the unprecedented mobility of both individuals and entire populations, the blurring of national identities, the porousness of boundaries, the nearly unimpeded global flow of labor, capital, and goods. All of these things erase distances and erode barriers that had formerly been an inescapable part of the human condition. As I said, when I spent most of my life in the Washington, D.C. area, and then I taught for a number of years in New Orleans. But then when I moved to Tennessee, I expected to find myself in the provinces. I went to the local grocery store and found one of the most elaborate sushi bars I'd ever seen anywhere in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I said to my wife, "There are no provinces anymore." It's an example, one of countless examples. You could supply many more of what I'm talking about. So we live, to use a thudding cliche, but sometimes cliches have to be used because they're true. We inhabit an ever-shrinking and ever more interconnected world, a world in which it is theoretically possible for every living person to go anywhere that he or she wants to go, and to be made literally or at least figuratively present to any other person in ways that would have been inconceivable even 50 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, certainly 50 years ago, and promise to become even more vivid and socially transformative in the future. Now, as I think I've already suggested, I think there is much to celebrate about these developments. They, for one thing, they give a manifest, crucial support to one of the most powerful and fundamental and universally appealing of all American ideals, and that is the idea of freedom. We embrace freedom because we believe fervently in the full breadth of human possibility and share a conviction that no one's horizons in life should be dictated by the conditions of his or her birth. I think that comes as close to being a statement that almost all Americans would agree with as you can get in this otherwise fractious time. But it's equally obvious, I think, that something is now seriously out of balance in the way that we live. All the technological wizardry and the individual empowerment that flows from it has also served to unsettle many facets of life and given rise to profound feelings of disquiet and insecurity in many Americans and many others around the world. No one can reckon the cost, the human cost of these radical changes. But sometimes it seems that the costs may turn out to be far higher than we've imagined. Sometimes it seems, I think, to many of us, that we are careening blindly into uncharted and potentially dangerous territory, carried forward by the sheer momentum of change. And without fully considering the trade-offs involved in each of the changes that we embrace. Accompanying this disquiet is a gnawing sense that something important in our fundamental human nature is being lost, or abandoned, or sacrificed, or neglected in this headlong rush. And that this something, this je ne sais quoi, remains just as vital to our full flourishing as human beings as it was in the time when we had far fewer choices and far less individual empowerment. We also sense that the large-scale interconnectedness of things may be coming at too high a price. And this is, of course, I've already made the point about systemic risk being one of the prices that we've paid for the incredible degree of the interconnectedness of things. I might add, by the way, that terrorism, and in particular kind of terrorism to which we are vulnerable and prone, is very much a product of that same interconnectedness, both in the vulnerability of our financial and power systems. And when you just think of what 9/11 did to the economy, even leaving aside what it did to Lower Manhattan and what it did to 3,000 people, it doesn't necessarily have to do more than poke a hole in a particular place to bring about cascading effects that are immensely damaging. And of course, the mechanisms of publicity that would not have been possible if you didn't have a world media. You wouldn't have terrorists trying to garner publicity through spectacular acts of devastation. But it's not only these things. It's also that is part of this disquiet that I mentioned about how interconnectedness seems to be coming at too high a price. It may be something deeper, harder to define, but deeper, that the variety and diversity, spontaneity of the world, mystery even of the world as we've known it for all the prior centuries of human history is being gradually leveled and effaced and insensibly transformed into something standardized, artificial, rootless, pastless, and bland. A world of interchangeable airport terminals, franchise hotels and restaurants, a world of smooth surfaces designed to facilitate movement, but not to facilitate rootedness and the flourishing that comes from rootedness. Could it be the case that one of the chief things neglected in this pattern of ceaseless movement is precisely the opportunity to live settled lives of self-government and civic engagement, lives of active, engaged citizens, the kinds of lives that thinkers since the time of Aristotle have regarded as the highest expression of human flourishing? Could it be the case that these are the things that are at the bottom of what worry us about the world that we seem to be moving into? Now, I may be overdoing it with this concern, but I want to be sure that we don't see this just as a question of nostalgia or sentimental attachment to lost ideals of community, which often are very idealized versions of the community that actually existed and that represent forms of thick community, as sociologists say, that most of us would not tolerate, whatever we may say. I'm not advocating a wholesale rejection of modernity. I don't think it's really an option for us, although I also think it's very healthy and good and important to be willing to be severely critical of aspects of modernity that we accept blindly out of the notion that they represent progress, and that progress is always inexorable and always good. Instead, what I'm suggesting is we need to discover how, given the American people as they are, and American economic social life as it now exists, and perhaps as it can be made to be, but not necessarily as it can be imagined to be, given those things, that we can find means of fostering the richer and more various public life that we seek. The recovery of place and of human scale that goes with it in our personal and public lives would appear to be central to this undertaking. And not only to that undertaking, but such a recovery is paradoxical, also central to the health of the very dynamism that it seeks to restrain. I think there are compelling reasons to believe that if we were to ever actually achieve an entirely fluid and protean world, devoid of established physical points of reference, such as settled communities and stable families and all that old-fashioned stuff, completely lacking in the shared reserves of common histories, memories, and loyalties to particular places that such stability promotes, that if that ever happened, it would be impossible to provide a foundation for the psychological or moral formation of individuals who would be strong enough, would be confident enough, resourceful enough, resilient enough to be effective citizens, effective marketeers, effective individuals within such a fluid context. Ironically, that liberal order depends on some illiberal institutions, if I may call them that serve to form the individuals that can compete effectively in it. These are the very kinds of individuals and institutions that a Republican form of government, small r Republican, a virtuous and active citizenry, and a free economy based on innovation and enterprise has to be able to count on these kinds of individuals if it's to survive. These are things that do not grow on trees or emerge unsought from the waves of the sea. They have to be rooted in certain fixities of social and moral life that can only flourish in settled places. In the word place, I think rewards a lot of analysis, more than I'm going to do tonight. But in both its literal and figurative sense, place refers not only to a geographical spot, but to a defined niche in the social order. I don't think it's a coincidence that it has both of those meanings. So that one's place in the world is both a physical place where one belongs and so when we say we found our place, we're not only talking about finding a physical location, but finding a mature, stable personal identity and a niche within a coherent social order so that you can answer the question, who are you? Where did you come from? What's your home? Where do you fit in the order of things? What's your niche? What's your sort of self-definition? Hence, it's not surprising that a disruption or weakening in our experience of geographical place will be reflected in similar disruptions in our sense of personal identity. The two things go together. Our sense of place, our sense of personal identity. And both of those things are addressed by the word place. But any effort to affirm the importance of place brings us into tension with the forces that are shrinking and transforming the world. A national government or global economy always will tend in the direction of consolidation and uniformity towards the imposition of a universal standard. The concept of place represents a counterforce to these huge structural tendencies. It's always grounded in the particular, even the provincial. Such an affirmation is not a mere attachment to the abstraction of place, but to this place. This place, scaled to our innate human sensibility towards specific hometowns and neighborhoods, and countrysides, and landscapes, each having its own enveloping aura of thoughts and desires and memories that is to say, its own history, its own customs, its own traditions, its stories, its foodways and folkways, its relics, its tombstones. Furthermore, what makes a place is not merely a loyalty to its past, but a conviction regarding the vitality of its present and the lure of its future. Far from being static, a healthy and vibrant place must be a node of continuous human activity, political, economic, and cultural. These are the forces that make a living place different from a museum. A living place has to offer scope for the energies of its people. That's why I emphasize the importance of fostering civic engagement and active citizenry, for it's only through that kind of engagement that the virtues of self-governance and public commitment can be exercised. This is something that the American federal system, as I've said, tries to preserve, even with the advent of a national-scale government. I'll just read you a passage from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which is always a salutary thing. It's one of my favorite writers, so I love to read him because he's so prescient about so much about American life. And this is from one of his chapters dealing with American individualism, which he saw as a very threatening force, that Americans would not be able, they were so individualistic that they wouldn't be able to pull together for any kind of common purposes. And one of the ways that he saw that Americans combated this tendency was through local associations, through the power of place. Let me just read a couple passages here. The legislators of America, by which he means the framers of the Constitution, did not suppose that a general representation of the whole nation would suffice to ward off a disorder natural to the frame of democratic society, and so fatal, that is, this individualism. They also thought it would be well to infuse political life into each portion of the territory in order to multiply to an infinite extent opportunities of acting in concert for all the members of the community. In other words, having every little place have its mayor, have its justice of the peace, have its sheriff, have its board of selectmen, have its zoning boards, and so on and so forth, ad infinitum. He thought all of this complexity and all these levels of government and all these posts were good. The plan, he says, was a wise one. And here's why. It's difficult to draw a man out of his own circle to interest him in the destiny of the state, because he doesn't clearly understand what influence the destiny of the state can have on his own lot. But if it be proposed to make a road cross the end of his estate, he will see at a glance that there's a connection between this small public affair and his greatest private affairs, and he'll discover, without it being shown to him, the close tie which unites private to general interest. And then he goes on to make the point that this kind of local freedom actually binds people more closely and more affectionately and more authentically to the nation than if the national loyalty was proposed in a way that had to override these local considerations. So that in his view, the American system, operating ideally, uses the power of local associations, which gives citizens the opportunity to act as citizens, to do things as active, virtuous citizens, or even unvirtuous ones, but at least to act as citizens. That by giving them those opportunities, it actually feeds their national patriotism, their natural affinity, their natural bond to the nation as a whole. Paradoxically, because you might think that local loyalties would subtract from national loyalties, but Tocqueville makes the case that actually the American system is so constructed as to cause one to feed into the other. Now, I think it's worth asking the question, does a society that has lost the sense of place through mobility, through interconnection, through the very tenuous sense that we have of belonging to the places where we find ourselves. Does that loss of the sense of place also cause us to forfeit the ability to forge the kinds of connections that Tocqueville is praising, and perhaps even lose the desire for them? Do we, in losing our places, lose a crucial basis for healthy and resilient individual identity and for the cultivation of public virtues through civic engagement? And if these dangers are real ones, is there a way that intelligent public policy can begin to address them constructively by means of reasonable democratic innovations that are likely to attract wide public support? It's an open question. It's very easy, but I wanted to stress it's easy to see this as a sort of optional question or an aesthetic one. A lot of people see questions of city planning, of the development of parks and the construction of highways and so on as first and foremost transit issues, but aesthetic issues that are not quite so important as more hardcore political issues. But I think this is all wrong. These are issues that go to the most fundamental purposes of human society, as I tried to suggest by beginning with Aristotle, who is first among those who gave thought to the fundamental purposes of human society. And at a time when the size and scope of our national government is once again an issue of heated debate, the proper place and form of civic engagement could not be more germane. The restoration of place, the careful rethinking of scale go hand in hand with the healthy revitalization of an engaged public. I think it's a mistake to reject this interest in place as something fanciful or backward-looking. I think instead it could be argued we must recover a more vibrant sense of place if we are to preserve the healthy dynamism of our own society and promote the highest level of human flourishing. You might put it this way, that we want to help the modern world address its own deficiencies before the ill effects of those deficiencies undermine it completely. The complaint can be made that this emphasis on place is stifling to enterprise, to the free operation of business. But I think it's at least worth considering, and I'm sensitive to that issue, but I think it's worth considering that there really can't be any vigor or intrepid boldness in a society that's unable to provide the conditions for the formation of strong identities, the kind of men and women who are capable of innovation or pioneering thinking. Or to put it in the words of the historian William Leach, one of the authors we're reading in the seminar, and I think these are words that link all the different strands of what I've been talking about. People require a firm sense of place so they can dare to take risks. A society whose common store of memories has been beaten down or shattered is open to further disruption. For such a society cannot defend or protect itself from the stronger incursions of those who know what they want and how to get it. A sense of place in that view may be an essential basis of our freedoms. Well, I actually have a little more to say, but I think maybe I should stop there and open the floor to your questions and thoughts, reactions. Thank you.